This Week in Parasitism is brought to you by the American Society for Microbiology at microbeworld.org/TWiP. This Week in Parasitism, episode number 85, recorded on March 25th, 2015. Hi, everybody. I'm Vincent Racaniello, and with me is Dickson Despommier.
Hello, Vincent.
Welcome.
Thank you.
And Daniel Griffin. Welcome.
Daniel. Yeah, I am here and happy to be here, so welcome to everybody.
Daniel, what are you up to these days? Are you doing research here?
Mainly doing research, and I'm also trying to get a lot of stuff together for some upcoming presentations. I've had a lot of clinical stuff I'm pulling together, and I'm trying to get this article back out to JVI, my basic science stuff, and seeing patients. Boy, yesterday was busy. I'm leaving for a couple weeks, so everyone, I think, heard this, so I had about twice as many on my schedule as usual.
You're leaving for a couple of weeks. 2 weeks?
2 weeks. 2 weeks.
And going where?
England. I hope I'm going to England. The plan is to depart Saturday morning and spend a week in London and then a week on a farm.
Nice. Oh, then when you come back, you're going to have to check the box. I've been on a farm.
I've been on a farm.
This is true.
Exactly.
What are you going to do on a farm?
The kids are going to milk goats and pick up eggs from the chickens and just have the farm experience in Kent, actually.
Now, why are we going to a British farm and not a nice Iowan farm?
Yeah, what's wrong with you, Murray? You know, we've gone to farms here too, and we just figured if we were going to visit England and see the countryside, that seems like a nice way to visit the countryside, to stay on a farm.
So, from a parasitological view, what dangers await them on a British farm?
Well, there are sheep, but there are no dogs.
Okay, that's good.
So my kids are happy about that.
Yes, they probably asked you specifically, right?
I wonder how well, if they had dogs, they would be deworming those dogs. But the hope is that we're not going to acquire any parasitic diseases while there.
Okay. Well, enjoy, and we will await your return. We are not going to record until he comes back. Is that right, Dickson?
Well, we are not. No. We're bound and committed to a trio now.
Bound and committed.
You bet.
When are you coming back?
Well,
Daniel?
I will be back, it'll be 2 weeks from Sunday. Where does that put us? About the 12th or so of
that's
April.
the 12th of April.
Yeah, so maybe we can squeeze something in that coming week.
Yeah, that week would be good, because that will be 1, 2, 3 weeks from today.
A hiatus.
So
a week's hiatus.
Yeah, it's okay. All right, we have a lot of replies to our TWiP 85 case. Can you remind us, Daniel, what that was about?
Oh, definitely. And thank you for everyone who sent in emails. We are getting lots of emails, and that is great.
Yes.
We switched this slightly, restricted format where we don't give as many clues, which I thought was great. So let me just summarize what we did say. We presented a case of a 36-year-old woman who came into my private practice, into the office in Fort Collins, Colorado in August, with a chief complaint of diarrhea that she reported had been going on for 5 days. The stools were described as watery, occurring 4 times per day. She described some mucus in the stool. She reported stomach cramps and nausea. And she reported that she had a low-grade fever, which we actually confirmed in the office. She told us that no one else was sick, and this included her husband, who works in the tech industry, her 4-year-old son, and we elicited a backpacking history. And we got a little bit of labs. We were told that there were no leukocytes or blood in the stool. And then we were waiting on a bunch of tests to come back.
All right. Our friend Jan from Rotterdam, this one is a bit more tricky. Both Giardia and cryptosporidium are possible. The symptoms are more those of crypto, so that would be my semi-educated guess. Most of that education comes through you, with some help from CDC web pages. Thanks for the podcast. The weather report from Rotterdam. The sky is 50 shades of gray. Need I say more? I understand that's your favorite book, Dickson.
I don't know anything about the book or the television show. I haven't paid attention to it at all. It's
I haven't
totally
either.
off my radar screen.
Me too, Dickson.
So I have no idea what they're talking about.
Okay.
Also, I think it involves a lot of S&M.
I don't know. All right, Michael writes, I'm guessing Giardia lamblia. Beaver fever, go OSU. Even though
That's
Daniel,
an odd animal to have as your mascot, but go for it.
even though Daniel made it sound like it wouldn't be the obvious answer. Really like this part of the show that engages the listener. Mike is from Oregon. Robin, our physician friend, if the three stools had tests for crypto requested and performed, then a string test might be considered. Empiric treatment with metronidazole is not quite kosher, but might be cheaper.
Do people understand what string test is?
I don't.
Would you like a definition for that?
Is that when you swallow a string
You do.
and then you pull it out?
You do. I thought you said you didn't know what it was.
That's not what it is.
You know what, Vincent? That's
Listen,
exactly what it is.
Don't carry your hostility into the show, okay?
No. No, this is leftover from this morning. We won't go there. You're going to edit this out anyway. So the point is that it is just exactly what you described. There's a little capsule. The end of the string is a braided nylon string, and you tape it to the outside of the cheek of the patient. Then you let them swallow it at night after dinner, and they sleep on this, and they sleep. That is to say. And the string unwinds from the capsule, goes through the stomach, and it embeds itself into the mucosal lining of the first half of the duodenum. And then the next morning, before they eat, they come into the clinic, and the physician, with gloved hands, of course, withdraws the string rapidly. And, of course, there's a gag reflex that you have to worry about there. And then for the last foot of this braided nylon string, they express the fluid that's accumulated in it onto a slide. They touch the slide with a cover slip, and they examine it under the microscope.
Is he correct, Daniel?
Most of what he's saying is true. Yeah, actually, all of it.
Well, we had a little...
It is not a test that we do that often anymore. Things
No,
have
it
gotten
isn't.
better.
That's right.
You could imagine. Would you really want to undergo this? It's a string, and there's a gelatin capsule at the end, and just like Dickson is describing, you tape this to your face. You probably tell no one to come visit you.
Right.
Fortunately, we have better tests to look for. For Giardia these days.
Right, but you can discover other things that way too, by the way. And one of the things that they used it for in the invasion of, Grenada, the island of Grenada,
Yeah, got it.
was they had 6,000 Marines, and they did string tests on 6,000 Marines afterwards.
Wow.
And they found a combination of things, including strongyloides.
Okay. Robin also talks about teeth, but we'll save that for later. Elise writes, Dear TWiP Collective, thank you so much, as always, for your wonderful podcast. Again, I was very pleased to have had a successful diagnosis with 84. I'm not sure if I can continue my streak, but here's what I suspect. I think he has Giardia, but I will hedge my bet with crypto. She goes on to talk about the similar symptoms commonly infecting people in the summer and early fall, similar incubation periods. I tried to see if either Giardia or crypto are more easily detected in a stool O and P, but as it turns out, they can be both hard to spot even on multiple tests. I did find a couple of sources that indicated that Giardia, due to intermittent or low levels of shedding, might be somewhat harder to find on the O and P.
Yep.
Which could account for why the three tests came up negative. Another reason I'm inclined to suspect Giardia is that it seems to be somewhat more common in Colorado. Also, it has the nickname Beaver fever, and Dr. Griffin did mention that the family saw quite a number of beaver while camping.
Right.
It's a good clue unless it's a red herring. So I'm not committing 100%
Red herring.
to
A beaver could be a
Giardia.
red herring.
I was interested to see that both of these infections can resolve on their own in people who are not immunocompromised. I was also surprised to see that even though there are many official websites cautioning people to bring their own water while camping, or at least to filter water and treat it, there are still wilderness types who seem to think such precautions are silly,
Right.
and which recommend trying to drink water from fast-running streams and creeks. They seem to be asking for it, all in capital letters. But of course, I'm now dying to know what sort of infection this woman had, so I'll be checking in regularly. As always, thank you so much. Lots of rain today in Lower Manhattan.
Yeah.
The weather will be swell for the half marathon that is happening tomorrow.
Huh.
Did you run in that, Dixon? I mean, Daniel?
No,
Daniel.
I didn't.
I know you
I
didn't.
did not.
I know you didn't.
I used to be a runner, and then I hurt myself, actually, on a trail run. And since then, my wife has wisely forbidden me from anything of any significant length. I'll do the turkey run, things like that.
Yeah. I did run the marathon in New York once.
I heard. You used
But
to be skinny.
It was a long time ago. Well, I used to be a lot of things that I'm not anymore.
Name one other thing.
How about active in a way that no restrictions on climbing? I used to love climbing down into steep ravines and fishing small rivers and stuff. I don't.
You can't do it? Why?
I've gotten old.
What does that have to do with it?
Plenty.
Tell me.
You want to know all of my symptoms?
No.
I think he worries. I went fishing with Dickson once, and
did?
you know, it was like my grandmother. Don't, you're gonna fall over there. I've seen people fall. I'm like,
People fall.
I'll tell you about a person who got really hurt over there. I'm like, you know, Dickson.
I do want to say one thing about drinking water when you're out in the woods. There are some safe sources of water, especially if you're up in alpine regions where there are snow deposits that still exist. So if you can find one of those situations, and I've been in many of those, you can actually drink the water that's melting off of those glaciers, all right?
Yeah,
Because
yeah.
ordinarily there's nothing above them that you have to worry about. But when you're drinking water from a river or a stream even, you're never sure of what's on upstream from where you are. And indeed, beavers. But you also mentioned something else, Daniel, which should have alerted the diagnosticians out there to a second possibility, which they had mentioned. But you did mention, besides beavers, you did mention something else.
No, and I think perhaps after we run through all the emails, we can do a little discussion about water safety in the
Right.
wilderness, water safety
You
review,
bet.
because it is important.
Oh, absolutely.
Christine writes, Dear Dickson, Vincent, and Daniel, another fascinating TWiP, and she guesses crypto. Although the Beaver reference suggested Giardia, the symptomatology didn't match as well. The O&P didn't show parasites, as they are often tricky to pick up, and a ZN stain may help locate them in stool rather than a straight wet mount. Incubation period is a little longer than I'd like if it was picked up on the camping trip, but everyone is different. No treatment other than good hand hygiene to avoid contaminating others, and sufficient hydration is required. Should resolve in a couple of weeks. Cheers from Chris from Brisbane, where the weather is 32°C, blue skies and a light breeze.
Yeah.
It's hot
Yeah.
down there, right?
The ZN is the Zeal-Nielsen.
Which is
test.
a modified acid fast test, which we will discuss. I think that's a great thing to have included
Yeah,
in
good
the email
segue.
there.
Good segue.
So we were going to definitely discuss that.
All right. Rebecca, hello, TWiP doctors. I have finally caught up to the most recent episodes. Was planning to respond to episode 84 when I saw a new one was posted. For me, the crayfish was not the telling sign that this was paragonomiasis. Paragonomiasis.
Perfect.
It was Daniel's description of the symptoms, particularly the rust-colored, blood-tinged sputum. I teach clinical micro for medical laboratory technicians at a
Nice.
community college, so I am familiar
Nice.
with the classic presentation.
Yeah, we
I
were
sh-
actually talking about this out North Shore, where I see a lot of patients yesterday morning. And outside of the U.S., the number one cause of hemoptysis, coughing up blood, actually is paragonomous.
Wow.
Goodness gracious.
Yeah, so
Not cavitary
She says
tuberculosis.
that-
that was what we discussed. That's what I think most people would have
Jeez.
thought, but no, it's...
Wow.
So she says paragonomous is a favorite board of certification question. And she says, I shall be recommending this podcast to my students, especially the new format should help cement the knowledge into their heads
Nice.
by getting them to think about real patients.
Yeah.
I suggest crazy glue.
Yeah.
As for the case in the current episode, I believe this is cyclosporiasis. Cyclosporiasis. The main reason I picked this organism over crypto or Giardia is because the X3 ova and parasite exams came up to three different, came up with negative results, and because the other members of the household were not sick. Person-to-person transmission is unlikely with Cyclospora, since the oocysts take days to sporulate and become infective.
Look at
The
that.
O&P exams were likely negative because there are not many, if any, recognizable oocysts in the feces. Laboratories do not typically screen for Cyclospora unless there's a specific request, since testing requires the use of acid-fast staining or PCR methods. Therefore, a routine O&P would not yield positive results. If this woman had consumed raspberries instead of drinking contaminated water, it would have been another classic board's question. This disease is typically self-limiting if the patient's in good health. If not, try methoprim or sulfamethoxazole.
Yeah.
I love the podcast. Thank you all for your hard work.
The reference to raspberries, by the way, is rather cryptic, excuse the expression here, because of the reference to the organism itself. But there were outbreaks of Cyclospora traceable back to some imported raspberries from Guatemala.
Okay.
And one
Yes,
wondered,
yes.
how in the world
Yes.
can a fecal contamination occur on such a delicate object as a raspberry, and then at such a high vine that the raspberries are growing off the ground? So it obviously must have been a food handler. But it happened twice within a 2-year period, I think. And so it was really recommended that they stop importing raspberries from that place.
We talked about that on the
we
TWiP,
did.
You know. Do you
we
remember?
We did. Yep.
One of the first things they tried to do is they said, "Oh, well, we'll just spray it with like a dilute bleach. We'll use a chlorination too." And unfortunately,
can't do that with raspberry.
they should have asked the question first: would that actually kill the Cyclospora? Because it doesn't. This is resistant to that.
Right.
So it created a bit of a problem. And then there was a huge problem in Texas where apparently they couldn't tell the difference between a raspberry and a strawberry. So they were basically...
Hey, trust me, people in Texas know the difference, but some people in Texas didn't know the
Yeah,
difference.
some people did. Some people got confused.
Most do know the difference.
So it had, unfortunately, a big impact on the strawberry industry as well. It should have
Yep.
just been the Guatemalan raspberries.
Here.
Ruben writes, Dear Majestic Trio, my training was in physics and math, and I will be succinct. Google diarrhea and beaver to get the answer. Giardia, a.k.a. beaver fever. He goes on to talk about additional tests, but he has a suggestion for future case presentations. I think the case should not be Googleable from the keywords. Now we're getting tough here, right?
No,
Well,
this
you
is good
know.
because we're going to claim that maybe it's not Googleable. Maybe it's not Giardia.
That's correct. Maybe you didn't get it right.
Weather in San Diego is always the same. Not much to
That's
talk
true.
about.
It is
Deep
almost the
respect and appreciation. Mark writes, Dear TWiP 2.0 team, I've been an intermittent TWiP listener since episode 1. Intermittent only because of the variable recording and release schedule.
I'm getting nasty looks from Vincent right now.
It's okay, Dickson. The show is great. This year's reboot and addition of Dr. MD, PhD Daniel Griffin to the podcast has catalyzed an exciting TWiP renaissance.
We're so pleased to hear that.
Yeah, Mark is our friend, actually, from the early days of TWiV.
Nice.
He goes way back.
Nice.
I listened to TWiP 85 while driving home to San Jose, California, from a weekend getaway to the Central Coast to celebrate my birthday. Over the weekends, Paso Robles and San Luis Obispo, temperatures hit the mid-80s. California's drought is very real.
Yeah, also.
So he likes this week's
Cool.
test. His candidates are crypto and Giardia, and he goes on to say why. Many forms of crypto exist targeting different mammalian hosts. Crypto is very prevalent, can be spread via cows, and gives some links. And he talks about the symptoms. Based on the patient's symptoms more completely matching those for crypto and the direct contact with cow feces, I conclude the patient is suffering from crypto. And it gives a link. Okay. Keith writes, Dear all, love the TWiP reboot. Dr. Griffin blends wonderfully with the milieu. We have not heard a story from Dr. Despommier in a while. He is a fantastic storyteller. Also from Dr. Racaniello, I miss his explanations. For example, when he briefly describes the microinhibition and hemagglutination tests.
Yes.
The cases are just fantastic. It really heightens my attention while I'm listening and makes me read and think after listening to the episodes. Having lived and hiked in backcountry of the Rocky Mountains of Colorado, the first two things that instantly jumped into my mind were Giardia and crypto. In the 90s, when I lived in Colorado, I was convinced that my dog had Giardia. She would have explosive, extremely foul-smelling diarrhea with mucus intermittently. As long as she had access to the outside, all was okay. But one year, we did have an awful Christmas tree incident. Let's just say I had to remove many of the branches from one side.
Oh, dear. Oh, dear.
Cryptosporidium. Okay. Anne writes, Dear TWiP team, so enjoying the new format. Excluding bacterial and viral causes of diarrhea, crypto and Giardia seem the most likely based on the consumption of unfiltered water. Giardiasis is also associated with fever, and the stool is described as a floating and greasy. I briefly considered amoebic dysentery due to entamoeba or strongyloides, but they seem less likely water contaminants. Crypto is a common opportunistic infection in SIV-infected macaques and often sets up infection outside the GI tract. She sent us 2 micrographs to support her case. A markedly enlarged salivary gland duct with thickened mucosa and inflammatory infiltrate, and another one, a higher magnification. And it's also from Oregon, and she's from Beaverton.
There you go. There you go.
And we got a couple this morning. Nancy writes, TWiPers, Beaver fever, giardiasis. My grandmother picked this up when my parents lived in Fort Collins.
Whoops.
She never remembered drinking anything not treated whilst visiting Estes Park, but was diagnosed after returning home to Reno. A lifetime Western resident, she was savvy to the symptoms and felt vindicated when her doctor's lab test confirmed her self-diagnosis. She believed she must have picked it up via washing her hands in the creek down the block from the home in Fort Collins. This was 20 years ago. Sure, Dan, Fort Collins is a city of sorts, but quite livable, being a college town with a high percentage of college graduates. Well, if I'm wrong, it's because I'm a happy unit clerk at our local hospital's outpatient surgery unit as my retirement job. My sole diagnostic qualifications are curiosity and long life experiences. I do enjoy all the Twixes. TWiP the most due to fewer dictionary and PubMed lookups necessary. Podcast on, and thank you for your generously donated work. Maybe you know her.
Hey, what was her name?
First name is Nancy.
Okay. We'll have
that's Nancy.
In Fort Collins. She's working
Yeah.
at the hospital.
No, I was chief of medicine at there's one hospital in Fort Collins.
Yeah.
So by the way, if you're listening, I'm the same Dan Griffin of Alpengo Medical, one of the internists there, and I was chief of medicine back, when was that? 2008. So about 6 years ago.
Richard guesses Cryptosporidium bovis, arguing against Giardia, watery stools, not steatorrhea, and the negative studies. Question for the panel: which waterborne organisms, viruses, are not killed with iodine? Do filters miss anything? Boiling? Thanks, guys. Keep them coming. So we'll talk about that later, right?
Yeah, definitely.
Sure. Jeff, I love the new format. After weeks of speculating in my daily commute, I'm going to take a stab at the case. This week is Giardia. Beaver fever, focus on beavers. The negative O&P threw me off a bit, so I did some digging and found this is diagnostic in only 70% of cases, and the cysts are not shed in stool on a consistent basis. You should try not to drink the water from any streams around Durango, as past mining activity left the streams with a pretty high mineral and metal content and other runoff from those activities. Jeff is from South San Francisco. Carol writes, I'm writing with a guess for the case study. I'm a veterinary technician, but I've recently returned to university to get a degree in microbiology and pathogenesis. I love your podcast, which I discovered 3 weeks ago, and I'm working my way through back episodes. I immediately thought the case was giardiasis, particularly with the repeated mentions of beavers, but that doesn't usually cause a fever. I then amended my guess. I hesitate to use the word diagnosis since it's a guess, to cryptosporidiosis. Am I close? Enjoying the sunshine and spring flowers in Victoria, British Columbia.
Nice.
While listening to podcasts.
It's a beautiful place.
One more from our friend Varun in Bangalore. TWiP 85, I would like to do a string test.
See?
The stress on beaver and iodine makes me think of giardiasis. I'm not sure how to explain negatively for stool O&P, really stabbing in the dark. I happen to, and then he sends us an article about malaria saying that the change in brain volume leads to increased intracranial pressure, may play a role in the fatality of cerebral malaria. I wonder if this is TWiPable. We'll take a look at that. All right, that's it. That's good, though. We had a great response to
Wonderful
TWiP 80. What do you
response.
think of those, Daniel?
I think those are some great answers, great ideas. So let us run through what we were thinking and why we were thinking it. Now, Giardia is a great answer, and I did see a lot of cases of Giardia while I was out in Fort Collins, and I even got to experience my own Giardia. And I think, as I mentioned earlier, these are all, one, real cases, but two, I'm trying to make them gettable. So this is not an atypical presentation. This is actually a presentation consistent with this particular organism. Now, if it had been Giardia, and I'm going to tell you right if it was not Giardia. If it had been Giardia, the diarrhea, it's a malabsorptive diarrhea, which means you're not going to absorb fats well. And why does this happen? If you actually look in the intestines, the Giardia will cover the surface of the like a sheet, preventing you from absorbing fats. Now, all the fats are then going to move down into the colon, and you're going to get this foul-smelling stool. And people actually look at their feces. Feces usually does not float, but the feces you get with Giardia, it's actually, one is you feel like you got to take a shower afterwards because it's hard to get clean, and the stools float. So it's a fatty, a sticky, a malodorous,
Frothy.
and floaty, and a frothy.
Which
so it's
part of the intestine is being coated? The
a
small
lot
or
of
the
it's small
large?
intestine,
Small intestine.
Yeah.
where you would be absorbing your fats. And actually, that's your small intestine is where we absorb most things. The colon is a lot of pulling the last bit of water out to give us our formed stool.
So we don't need our colon, actually, right?
You don't really need it. And actually, there are people that have no colons for different reasons. Have had the colon completely removed,
Yeah.
and they actually invented this in the New York area, where they take the terminal part of the small intestine after removing and make a rectum. People have to go to the bathroom a little more often because you're not getting that last bit of fluid
Storage.
taken out.
Okay.
But no, you can live without a large intestine.
Yeah, it was suggested that I have mine removed.
Because
Well, both my parents died of colon cancer.
right.
So my father's physician at his wake said, "You might think about a colectomy." I said, "No,
Gee whiz.
thank you."
Yeah. No, and I
Gee
think
whiz.
it's called, is it a Hartman's pouch where they take that last bit and sort of create this false, so you operate,
So
normally.
you wouldn't leave the rectum and just take the rest of the colon?
The problem is the rectum is part of colonic tissue. So if you're really going to have to remove, let's say it's a risk of cancer or it's ulcerative colitis, an inflammatory type bowel disease, you want to remove all the
Everything,
tissue and then create this modified
I didn't do it.
rectum.
I didn't do it.
No.
I just go for a colonoscopy every week. Just
Not
kidding.
quite.
Just kidding.
Not quite.
And the other aspect about Giardia, I'll say, Giardia is non-invasive. There's no fever. There's usually no systemic symptoms. Now, you do feel crummy when you've got all this malodorous diarrhea. You get a bit of cramping, etc. But the low-grade fever wouldn't have been typical of Giardia. But what is the differential going into this? They've got diarrhea, the exposure's up in the water. Giardia would be reasonable to have in there. And I did, in this case, order a stool Giardia antigen test, which was negative in addition to the O&P.
Right.
At this point in time, a different antigen test wasn't available, which has now become available. And actually, that was what it turned out to be. It turned out to be crypto. I think a lot of our listeners. So that's in there too. Crypto is probably the next one after Giardia.
Yes.
And why was it not seen on the O&P? And that was, as one of our listeners wrote in, the ZN, the Zeal-Nielsen, or the modified acid-fast staining. A normal O&P will not detect cryptosporidium. So if you just say, "Oh, I'm worried about cryptosporidium, I'll order my O&P," it's going to be negative, and you're going to, potentially miss this unless you know this. This is a little pearl for anyone who's going to try to diagnose this. But more recently, they've introduced, just like Giardia, a rapid antigen test. So instead of ordering 3 O&Ps, do serial every other day, you could just say, "Please check the stool for the Giardia crypto rapid antigen." And I brought a little picture for our
Yes, we see that.
for our parasitologist.
Ah, yes.
But one of the things is the size. These will be these modified acid fast positive balls, little circular objects in the stool. And I always memorize Cyclospora as my reference because that's the 10 micron, and then this is going to be about 5 microns.
Right.
And there's a less common infection we won't talk much about called a microsporia, and that's only 1 micron, which is really tiny.
Right.
So one of our listeners guessed Cyclospora.
Yes. So what about Cyclospora? Why is it not that? And as we talked about, Cyclospora has been a contaminant of raspberries. I think it could have been, Cyclospora is definitely something that could have been, but wasn't a consistent exposure history for that.
Exactly. It's foodborne also, which not waterborne. So when you look at the epidemic that was recorded, I think it was about 3 years ago, that they had a lot of states involved in the distribution of a particular food item that was traceable back to the source of the infection. It's not likely that the infections that the people acquire have then been passed on to somebody else, but these things are infectious almost immediately after they exit the intestine.
Had you guessed Cyclospora, Dickson?
No, I guessed Cryptosporidium.
I'm sorry, crypto. I meant you guessed crypto.
No, crypto.
Yeah. Now,
The symptoms were absolutely classic.
Crypto.
Yeah,
Okay.
watery stool. It's secretory diarrhea, basically, not exclusionary diarrhea as you're getting from Giardia.
So the
infection.
beavers didn't throw you.
Nah. As soon as he mentioned a lot of free-range cattle in the area, that was a tip-off for me.
Daniel, what cinched the diagnosis? What particular part?
I think in this case, as a lot of our listeners realize, when you were looking at the exposure to potentially contaminated water while people were backpacking, if you've lived out west, you are quickly drawn to Giardia versus Cryptosporidium. And then the symptoms. With the Giardia, it's going to be a fatty smell, foul smelling, where it's a profuse watery diarrhea and a low-grade fever with your crypto. So that should help us to some degree.
So most people had picked both because they couldn't distinguish, but
Yeah,
that's how
exactly.
they could do it. Yeah.
And I think that, in all honesty, did I know for certain? I still went ahead and ordered the test. Because not every pathogen and patient read the textbooks before they come in. Sometimes they come in and they describe it as, "Oh, it smells terrible." Oh, it might smell terrible because now they're noticing.
Yeah.
But yeah, so in this case, it was nice to confirm.
So there was
it.
another test that used to be run too. It's worth mentioning. It's called the Sheather's sugar flotation method.
Wow, that's a mouthful.
It's a mouthful, but on a watery diarrheal specimen, in order to concentrate the oocysts, which these things are, they are actually buoyant in a certain percentage of sucrose solution. So you mix like 1-to-1 solution of the stool with the sugar solution, and then you put a cover slip over the top of it after you've centrifuged. And so the centrifugation takes all the debris and puts it at the bottom, and the buoyancy of the oocysts rises to the top. And then afterwards, you just touch the surface with the cover slip and look at it underneath. If you had a phase microscope, a lot of diagnostic labs don't have the luxury of having a phase microscopy setup. But if you did, you could make the diagnosis by seeing the sporozoites inside the Cryptosporidium.
So what about water safety?
Yes, water safety.
Who wants to go first on this one?
No, I like the topic of water safety. And if you're going to be in the backcountry for any period of time, the concept of bringing enough water for it's somewhat non-viable. I mean, even if you had pack animals and their only job was to bring enough water for everybody, it still would be a challenge. So people resort to, let's say, three main types of water purification. One is the boiling of the water. And then you run into the question of, but you're in Colorado, you're up at altitude, how long do you have to boil it? I'm going to be curious if Dickson has comment on this, but they've studied this. And it doesn't matter. In the U.S., the highest you're ever going to get is a little over 14,000 feet. The time it takes to bring water to a boil on a cook stove, by the time you get a rolling boil, you have probably killed most things. There used to be these 5, 10, 15. Probably the rolling boil is going to be what you need to do. The next option that people use quite a bit, that really is an excellent approach, is the filtration method.
Right.
And to get everything out, including viruses, you're going to have to use pretty tiny pore size, right?
Absolutely. And it's slow.
Yeah, and it's slow,
It's
and you're
very slow.
Yeah.
So on our
Very
canoe trip
slow.
upstate, which was 5 days, we had two kinds of filters. One, we would hang overnight on a tree and let it drip into a gallon container. So in the morning, the first time we set it up, it filled up and then tipped over. So it was empty. No. And also we had a pump filter that we would use. But after a few gallons, it would clog and you had to rinse it out.
That's right.
Yeah, and actually that's a challenge. Often we'll pre-filter it through a bandana, a cloth of some sort, to get the large sediment out before it's going to then go ahead and
that's a good idea.
Clog your filter.
We would just put the tube into the lake and start.
Yeah, some of them actually have a little pre-filter that goes on the end of that tube, so it gets through. And then I've seen even where there's a filter, it's actually a water bottle where you fill it with water, but then you're sucking it through a filter. You can end up with a headache.
Clumsy. That's right. So we talked about another episode on our TWiP where Dracunculus medinensis was the problem. And the Carter Center came up with a filtration method for getting rid of the copepods.
Daniel had one, remember?
Yeah, exactly right. So, you had the water flute, as it was called. I believe they named it to something like that.
The filter straw.
A filter straw.
We keep them scattered around my house. So yesterday, Barnaby was drinking water. So, Barnaby, you don't need to use that. We're in the U.S. That's purified water. So, but apparently it is fun.
It's fun to drink. It has no loopy loops like they used to have for the other straws. But so the difficulty of finding safe fresh water in the wild is precious. I mean, you can go days without water, and then you can't go too much further.
But the filter will take care of it, right?
It will if you're fortunate enough to have one. But again, the snowmelt idea is not so bad. I mean, if you're near a snow deposit, taking the snow off it. Remember the Eskimos' favorite saying, "Do not eat the yellow snow."
I thought that was Lou Reed. I thought if you go where the Huskies go, do not eat the yellow snow.
Well, but, okay. He learned it from the Eskimos.
My wife once traveled somewhere where the water was dodgy, and her company gave her a UV pen.
Yes.
What do you think about
that was
that?
sort of my fourth thing that I was going to mention. That people they have these UV pens. They have this UV device that takes batteries, and you could put it in your glass of water, leave it there for not very long, and then drink the water using UV purification.
Will that kill everything?
I would think so, right?
I'd worry
what would it not kill?
Well, it dimerizes thymines, doesn't it?
I'm thinking it's going to be very good for viruses, right? But maybe, are you going
right?
If you get into larger, let's say you are in a dracunculus endemic place, is UV really going to kill?
I don't think so. I don't think so.
That would be the problem. And I think the last thing that is in common usage is these iodine tablets.
Now let's talk about that
and
too.
that's a problem.
It's problematic. I mean, it kills off bacteria, right? And it probably slaughters viruses also, but it doesn't touch these cysts. So the Cryptosporidium oocysts or the Giardia cysts are not touched at all by that. So I would highly recommend not relying solely on iodine-treated water for your drinking source.
And the water, even for what it will be able to kill, here it is. You're up there. You're at altitude. The water's freezing cold.
Right.
You put the iodine in there. You shake it around. You try to get it into
and you're shaking. It doesn't dissolve.
And then you've got to wait.
I know.
And and you're ready to have a drink. And are you going to wait 2 hours?
Right.
And then you got to bring something to make the water taste a little better, because now it tastes like iodine. So no, it's a challenge. And I think the water purification through the filtering is probably one of the best options. At least that's what I would recommend.
Yes.
See, the boiling is the same issue. You have to wait for it to cool.
You
right?
have to sit down. You've got to set it boil the water. And now you've got hot water.
Yeah.
Right. I've never felt compromised in my decision to drink water if I were on a lake. If I was in a canoe and I was in the middle of a lake, and
Why not, Dickson?
because I think that the dilution factor is so big with regards to an inlet, say, for a little creek or a stream that comes into a lake, and then there's the lake itself, and then it has an outlet. A lot of the lakes in the Adirondacks don't have either one of those things. So if you're in the middle of a lake and you dip your oar down into the water, your paddle, and bring it up, you can actually drink the water right off of that. And I don't think there's been anybody that's gotten sick by doing that one. I think that's a safe way to drink water, too.
What about Lake Michigan, Dickson?
I think if you got 20 feet out from shore and started to drink the water, you're going to be fine.
Where was the outbreak of
No, that was different. That was in Milwaukee. That was
Milwaukee. It was from a sewage
it was
treatment
a
plant.
failure to communicate. I would say not really. It was a failure to filter the water. They were changing the filters while that occurred.
And what was the pathogen?
It was Giardia and crypto. They had both of them.
Both. Okay.
Yeah, but the tragedy was that remember the AIDS patients that didn't know they were AIDS patients found out by acquiring crypto because there's no drug here. So if this is Cryptosporidium as it is, I have a clinical question now for the doctor on call. How would you treat this woman?
Now, in this case, and I think one of our letter writers put in, most cases will resolve on their own without treatment. And this lady, no treatment, lasted another 5 days, and then she was better. And she's the only one who got sick. I think someone asked, how come she's the only one who got sick? Because this can really spread. This, when you have a bowel movement, when you pass feces, there can be a tremendous amount of potentially infectious
Innocent
material being
bystander
shed. So this lady did a really good job of, protecting her child and husband. Now, let's say you do need to treat this. There is an FDA-approved therapy for this, nitazoxanide. I'm sure I pronounced that wrong, just because I pronounce everything wrong now that I've been on the show.
It's not my fault.
So you can, in certain situations, if need be, let's say the person was immunocompromised, let's say it wasn't clearing on its own, there is an FDA-approved medication that can be used.
But I was told, at least from the older literature on that particular drug, that in immunocompromised patients, particularly those suffering from HIV/AIDS, that drug doesn't work.
That's, what you bring up is, unfortunately, the time that you want to use it is the time that it's not clear that it works. Without the immune system to help you, it's not clear what kind of efficacy we get when we treat immunocompromised people with this drug.
Yeah, I can remember hearing about this infection when it was first realized that the HIV/AIDS patients of large metropolitan areas were affected by this. Some of these patients were exhibiting 10 liters of stool a day, 10 watery stools a day. It looked like cholera almost. It was just an awful infection. And this infection just worked its way down the small intestine and without inducing any immunity whatsoever, and then they would die from electrolyte imbalances or from loss of sloughing of intestinal wall or stuff, secondary infections as a result of the lack of a proper intestinal wall to prevent microbes from going across and becoming bacteremic. It was an awful, awful situation. So at one point, it was realized that New York City's drinking water is not filtered.
Correct.
It actually comes down from the Catskills, from these 5 reservoirs, unfiltered. And if you look in the water at various times of the year, it's seasonal, you can find times when 10 liters of water will contain one of these oocysts per 10 liters of water.
Yeah, I still remember a whole discussion that was had about should people who are immunocompromised be putting filters in their home? Should they be filtering their water before they drink this water? And I think as one of our people said, not only were there issues in the New York area with crypto being in the water, but not too long ago, some of the public water sources out in Colorado would have Giardia in them. People would come out for a wonderful vacation in Aspen and then end up with Giardia from drinking water out of the tap.
Yeah. So there was again, these are anecdotal, but really interesting to point out. I stayed at a motel once in Thunder Bay on Lake Superior. And at the top of that bay, you'd think, this is a pristine area. There's nothing that can harm you up there. So the drinking water for Thunder Bay came from 2 separate places. This is not that big a place. Half of it came from a reservoir up in the mountains, and the other half came from Lake Superior. Now, the half that was from this little reservoir up in the mountains was pristine, provided that, and this is the provided that the guy who was hired to kill the beavers killed the beavers. So the year that he got sick, the beavers invaded the area and the water became contaminated, and half of the city's water supply was contaminated, and the other half is drinking a lake that's like the biggest freshwater lake besides Lake Baikal, without any ramifications whatsoever. So it's odd situations like this that really
that was
force
the
you.
weak link, the guy.
Exactly right. They said, the guy who hunts the beavers is sick this year, and that's the reason why our water is no good. Incredible. Doesn't he have a brother that could have done this? Or you would imagine that they could have compensated for that in some way. Or why don't you get all your water from the Lake Superior?
That was fine.
It was perfect. Absolutely perfect. Which is why I
take it from the center of the lake, I guess.
or away from the shoreline, or away from an inlet from a
Yeah.
river that comes in. That's true. So I think lake water would be the exception to this wilderness caveat.
So, Daniel, I have a stool question.
Yes.
You said that most stools sink. So when they float, what does that mean besides having Giardia?
Often, if the fat content is
higher.
elevated,
Yeah.
it will. I don't know if you've noticed this, but if you go to the pool, the people with a high fat content, it's easier for them to float. They're at one of the one of the universities, I don't recall which one. I think there are several where you have to pass a swimming test to graduate. It usually has some alumni. There's been a drowning accident, something like that. And so everyone has to. And if you take some of these football players who are rather dense with regard to muscle and don't have enough fat buoyancy, it can be quite hard for them to float.
Yeah, sure.
So yeah, stool is sort of like people. If you've got a high fat content, it's easier to float.
So if you have some diet change or some physiological change that prevents efficient absorption of fats, then your stool will float, basically. Right?
And actually, that can not even just infections, but if there's anything that's causing a malabsorptive diarrhea, you can end up with fatty floating stools.
So besides an infection, what would cause malabsorption?
Good question.
No, there's probably have people in our audience who have like lactose deficiency where they're having problems that way. Sometimes bacterial overgrowth, which we could see in our diabetics. People who have issues with motility will sometimes have fat malabsorption. And yeah, they'll end up. And even a quick dietary change. If you're usually a pretty healthy guy, and you decide you're going to the movie theater and getting that super size with extra butter, popcorn there, your intestines get used to a certain amount of fat absorption, and if you suddenly go above that, your body, it takes a little while to adjust, and it's not going to adjust during the eating of the.
Cool.
So what about sprue? There's a condition called sprue, and then there's one called tropical sprue.
Yeah.
Has that been brought forward in terms of another kind of diagnosis?
Well, I think that a lot of the sprue diagnosis have been replaced with this bacterial overgrowth.
Oh, okay, fine.
So no, it's a good one to bring up because it would often present with a malabsorptive diarrhea. Yeah. And they have a lot of great tests these days where they give you radio-labeled sugars and they do a breath test for the metabolism by the bacteria.
Right.
Which can be a little bit of a problem. Just if anyone orders this on someone with lactose intolerance, there's lactose in there, so they may be a little unhappy with you. You'll get your answer, but you may also get a phone call.
Surely you'll ask first.
You would hope so.
I would hope so.
Right. So where do you think she picked that infection up then?
I put that history in there of the son going over to check out the stream and falling in the cow patty. And my suspicion at the time was that she did a really, and moms are like this, right? They do a really great job of taking care of everyone but themselves. So she got her son super clean, got it all off. He was fine. And then she may not have done as good a job taking care of herself. So it probably was from the bovine contamination.
Got it.
Whether it was in the drinking water, whether it was that episode and got on her hands and then somehow got ingested is not clear. Yep. I think there's when we see someone with diarrhea, we've talked about several of the common parasitic organisms. We talked about Giardia with the fatty, floating, sticky diarrhea, the Cryptosporidium with the lots of water, the Cyclospora with often food contamination, and in the U.S. with raspberries. But this was actually described quite a bit in Nepal and Peru, and that was where I think they ran across the concept that that's very treatable with Bactrim. I think they tried Bactrim and it worked, which because it was a cheap, inexpensive, available.
Right.
And then the last one, which at some future episode may come up, the Isospora, which is the largest of these.
All right.
And one of the diagnostic things is to either go with the antigen testing in the stool or realize you're going to have to do a modified ONP with the modified acid fast testing to pick these up. Otherwise, you're going to miss them.
Well, we left one out, if you don't mind me adding it in there, and that's amoebiasis, so amoebic dysentery. If you want to distinguish between diarrhea and dysentery, what would be the clinical feature that you would point to?
Dysentery is supposed to mean blood in the stool. It's supposed to be bloody. And I always make that distinction. I say this person has diarrhea, this person has dysentery. Right. And that was why we made the comment about no leukocytes, no blood. This was diarrhea as opposed to dysentery.
You ever have dysentery, Dickson?
Never had dysentery. Thank goodness. No.
Either.
I've had a lot of diarrheal disease, so I've had my share. Ciprofloxacin is a companion of mine when we travel to areas where we suspect.
Ciprofloxacin.
Yeah, it's a good thing to carry with you.
Yeah, we've been, because of drug resistance, we've been gradually switching and using azithro a little bit more often because particularly in areas of India, Southeast Asia, there's been such an increase in the cipro resistance that you often end up resorting to an alternative agent. And it was all Dickson's fault.
Yeah, because, you take it with you, and I've only had to use it once. And I remember the incident, too. It was chili rellenos.
Chili rellenos.
Yes, with the cheese inside. I had two of them. I didn't have one. I had two. It was so good. I had two. This was in Pueblo, Mexico, where they make the old Volkswagen buses, bugs, rather.
Yeah. Is that where they make them?
But it's also a tile location. You go there for the tiles that they make. They're wonderful. It's a wonderful place, but the chili rellenos, Montezuma's revenge, as it used to be known as.
Dickson.
Yes.
We have a paper.
Really? Well, we do have a paper. This is not one of your run-of-the-mill papers either.
You know what one of the clues was? It's in the Journal of Immunology.
Well, yes.
Which tends to be a heavy-hitting
jargonistic
journal.
To the nth degree.
The title is Filarial Infection Modulates the Immune Response to Mycobacterium tuberculosis through Expansion of CD4-positive IL-4 memory T cells.
Right.
Daniel selected this paper. Is that
did.
correct, Daniel?
Yes.
Tell us why you're interested in this.
Right.
I think there were several aspects that make this paper worth reading. One is the big picture. What are they studying? For what reason are they studying this? And it has a lot to do with understanding TB and failure of our ability to control it with vaccine strategies. And that's what they claim is the whole point. What they're going to be telling us here is that if you look at vaccinating a population that has some other infection, you may find that the immunological response that you expect is lacking. And they're going to suggest, as we go through this paper, that when you try to create a protective immune response with regards to tuberculosis, if your population has a secondary infection, in this instance a filarial infection, you're not going to be able to get the immune response you're after. And this may explain past failures with vaccine strategies with regard to TB, and should hopefully inform people in the future looking at vaccination strategies in patients with regard to TB. And unfortunately, there's a tremendous overlap in the areas of the world that are most burdened by tuberculosis and filarial and other parasitic infections.
Not too long ago, we did a paper in a study of water buffalo, right?
Yes.
We did.
And wasn't that tuberculosis in the buffalo influenced by a worm infection?
Yes, it was. Yes, it was.
Probably similar mechanisms are at play.
And I think the nice thing, this is in the Journal of Immunology. The last one was in, I think, one of those throwaway rags, right? Wasn't it Science or something?
It was Science, yeah.
It was Science.
The kind that make you sick.
Can wrap your fish.
No,
in it.
I would say
right.
both of them do a good job of trying to look at the really the molecular mechanism behind this. And this paper focuses a lot on the memory T cell response. So as we go through here, we're going to learn a little bit about memory T cells, different types of T cells, and we're also going to hopefully learn a little bit about this interaction and why maybe there's been so much difference with regard to the efficacy of vaccine strategies in controlling tuberculosis.
So they have this is a study of people.
This is.
And they have some people who were infected with Brugia Malayi, was that it, or was it?
It's actually Loa. Yeah.
Sorry.
So let's.
Loa,
Yeah. So
yeah,
we could. They have two groups in this paper, and I guess we can start there.
It's in the table.
They
there,
have
yeah.
25 individuals, which they mark as infected,
Right.
with Loa, and then they have 14 uninfected control group, and we're going to criticize this a little bit. The uninfected are not uninfected from the endemic area. Now,
From somewhere else.
they're from here. They're,
Where were the infected
8
people from? Do we know?
We do, and they are different parts of Africa.
It's mostly West Africa.
Nigeria, Cameroon, Gabon, Central African Republic, and the
Congo.
DRC, the Democratic Republic of the
Okay.
Congo.
Right.
And they're comparing those to 16 people, living down in
Or
the
14
Washington
people.
area.
Yes.
14 people
Isn't
living
that
down in
a
Washington.
fatal error, though?
Well, if you went to these endemic areas and tried to find people that didn't have these infections,
So
you'd be
it's not even,
hard-pressed.
it's not possible to even do the experiment, you're saying?
Well,
I would have liked if they had at least chosen a control group of similar ancestry.
Yeah.
that would have been good.
That would have at least been. I understand
So
the
that-
argument that we want to find people who are uninfected.
Yeah.
But you also probably want the same genetic background because there's differences in
Right.
the immune response. in different populations.
No question.
And so I see that as, that is one challenge with this study design.
All right, so they are looking at memory T cells in this study, right?
Yes.
How would you take a patient and study the different memory T cells?
Now, they use a technique, really a wonderful technique called flow cytometry, which has really developed over the last several decades and become an incredibly powerful tool for immunologists. And they actually have one of the leaders in the field as one of the authors, Mario Roederer, who trained out at Stanford at the Herzenberg lab. And
who invented this technique, right?
Actually, Len. There's Lee and Lenore, and Lee unfortunately passed away just a year or two ago. I was at his 80th birthday, and he really is credited with being one of the people who invented this technique. And what you do is you take cells and you get them into, say, a single cell suspension.
So you bleed people.
You bleed people. You get the cells somehow,
and you
usually through bleeding them.
And you get rid of the red blood cells. And
there's a couple ways to do that. You can either lyse the red blood cells, or you can use a centrifugation technique where you centrifuge them and the white cells separate out. Then you take those. Usually it's white cells, but you can do flow cytometry on red cells. You can actually, the military does it on material. They're looking for materials that can't be detected by infrared, and they actually run materials. So you can run anything through these machines. What the machine does is it runs anything through. In our case, it's going to be cells, and one at a time, but this might be one at a time, 20,000 per second, past what we call an interrogation point. So it's in a stream of fluid.
Interrogation.
And then it will be interrogated. Well, what does that mean? How do you interrogate a cell?
We ran across
actually,
that.
It is. It's much like the way you interrogate a person. You shine a bright light at it. Yeah. And in this case, it's a laser at a certain wavelength, not that big white light that you remember from the black and white movies. And you can then, when you shine a bright light, it'll absorb a certain amount of energy, and then it will emit a certain amount of energy. Well, the people that study algae in our oceans just take the algae and send it right through, shine a light, and there's an intrinsic emission spectrum to autofluorescence to like the phytoplankton.
And you can also measure the size, which
and the size, and
characteristic,
even there's a side scatter based upon how complex. If it's like a bowling ball, there's not a lot of complexity. The more ruffles and irregularities, the more side scattering to the side of light you get. So even size and complexity, you don't need any kind of color. That's just you're interrogating with a laser. But what you're now going to add, because you want to understand memory cells, is you're going to add antibodies that are labeled with certain, called fluorophores, certain molecules, components that will absorb and emit at a certain color, in a certain spectrum. And for instance, we'll say we want to only look at T cells. So you're going to take an antibody that will recognize CD3. It'll have a certain...
all T cells.
So that's CD3 is going to be all our T cells. Then we say, we don't just want all our T cells. We want to look at the T cells that have CD4. So we're getting a second, so you send it through this point, and the point, there may really be 3 or 4 points because it's going to get hit by a laser at each interrogation point. So it may actually go past several. There may be a blue laser that hits it and gives
sequential?
off
Is it sequential?
It's sequential.
How many? What's the maximum number of colors you can interrogate? 6 or 8 or 12?
I think you're about 6 or 8 at this point.
Okay.
There's a ultraviolet, there's a violet, there's a blue, there's a green, there's a yellow, there's a red. We're at least 6, just thinking off the top of my head.
Okay.
In the military, maybe they even use more.
They don't tell us
because they're going to go in the infrared, right?
Yeah,
so
yeah.
you can, and it's a question of having the machine that does this. And actually, Fort Collins produces great machines. I think it's Beckman Coulter that produces out there.
They're in Fort Collins.
They're in Fort Collins making these flow cytometers.
And
do we get money from Beckman Coulter for mentioning? No, anyway.
No, we should.
So the first thing you do is and you're going to put these on all at once, but then it's going to go through the machine. And actually, each interrogation point, you could measure up to 10 or 12 different, we'll call them parameters, because you're going to have different detectors on the other end. So first you want to know, is the cell CD3 positive? So you
Okay,
boom,
T cells.
first thing you say, it's a T cell. Then we're interested is CD4 on the surface,
Which is what
which
they
is a
wanted to do in
particular
this
type
study, right?
of T
Because
cell.
CD4s are the helpers.
CD4 versus CD8. Yeah, and I think helper is the terminology that's pretty popular. It's also the type of T cell that's mainly affected in our HIV patients.
Right.
The CD4 is a co-receptor, unfortunately. For
So there's memory for both CD4 and CD8s.
that is true.
But they didn't look at CD8 memory.
They're just
T cells,
looking at
right?
CD4.
Why
in
is
this.
that?
A CD8 memory, I don't know if it's understood quite as well, and that really, that's actually what I would say. I think over time, people are going to demand, well, what about the CD8 memory and different subsets? But the different subsets and the plasticity within the CD4, the helper T cell population, is pretty well understood. So I think it was a reasonable way to go down.
So, Daniel, what do we actually mean by a memory CD4 cell?
So now we get to the next step. So now you've got your CD4 cells, and we divide them into naive. These are T cells that have been selected in the thymus not to be terribly self-reactive, to be able to go out in the world. And
Self meaning not react with the person that
yeah,
they're
in the thymus, what we do is we take all the T cells that might target us, and we get rid of them.
Right. We make them undergo apoptosis.
Yeah, the classic apoptosis. No, we do. And it's amazing. For every one we get, we kill about 1 million. It's extraordinary, the amount
This
of cell
happens
death.
during fetal development?
And it actually continues.
Through the first year of life or something?
Well, even farther. At some point, probably by our teen years, the thymus involutes, as we say, and probably becomes less important. But yeah, it actually continues for a period of time. Now,
it's also called education, right?
Is that what they call it?
That's what it is.
And if you don't pass the test, they kill you. So it's old style education.
Right, friend or foe, folk.
Yes, we would not allow this in our enlightened society.
The naive.
So they all come out naive.
They all come
out
CD4.
naive.
They come out of the thymus and they circulate. Some of them go to lymph nodes also, right? And
True, they go all
nodes.
over. They really go all over the place. A lot of them go to gut tissue. A lot of them go to lymph nodes. A lot of them circulate. They're all over the place. So now they're all naive, and then they have an experience.
Aha.
They experience something for the first time, and we can recognize based upon what proteins are on their surface whether or not they have grown up, whether or not they've gone through their
experience means they've encountered something foreign, right?
Exactly.
Like a bacterial or a viral or a fungal antigen.
Now, T cells, it's always going to be protein. T cells are very, I call them myopic. They can only see protein. And it has to be served up to them on a plate.
Right.
Here it is. Here's a protein.
A plate called the MHC molecule.
Exactly. That's the immunological plate.
Okay.
And only if you serve it to them properly.
That's mama's home cooking. That's MHC.
On a plate. Now, B cells, right? They're, those are the ones that we love because they'll recognize anything.
It's fun. I have to tell you a little story.
Yes.
Writing our virology textbook, we were describing this, and my colleague who wrote the immunology part, he likened the protein presented in the MHC molecule as a ball in a catcher's mitt. And we said, no, you have to change that because this is an international audience and not everyone.
That's right.
So we changed it to a hot dog and a hot dog bun, which may still not be universal, right?
Yeah,
Maybe
I wonder.
not.
I wonder.
Yeah. But the hot dog is the peptide that's presented to the CD4 cell or CD8, depending, and that educates it and makes it have an experience, as you said, right?
Yeah, and actually, I like the hot dog analogy because the hot dog I'm thinking is the peptide,
right.
And they can only be so long. They can only be like maybe up to 12 peptides.
This is a processed antigen then.
It is, Dickson.
So what is processing the antigen?
Well, it's inside of the cell.
Which cell?
So it can be a virus-infected cell, for example,
okay.
which inside that cell are proteins, viral proteins,
Yep.
and they're chopped up into these hot dog-sized peptides
Yes.
by the proteasome, which is a very large complex which has proteolytic activity. And then the peptides are pumped into the endoplasmic reticulum, the lumen, by a protein called TAP. the transporter for antigen processing.
Listen to him.
I just taught this to my class, Dickson, all right, last week.
This is good. No, this is...
And then the peptides are loaded into the MHC molecules,
Yeah.
which are made in the ER lumen, and then shipped up to the cell surface. And then the T cells come along and
they're
interrogate the
presented.
cell.
They're presented.
Yeah.
And they say, is this foreign? Or is it, if it's self, they say goodbye, have a nice day.
A lot of macrophages are involved in this too, right?
So if a CD4 encounters a foreign antigen that matches the CD4 specificity, then what will the CD4 cell do?
Yeah, the CD. So I'm going to take you back a step. Now as we've been describing, every cell in the body has all the processed proteins from with it presented on the surface on these platters, which we call them MHC1 platters. And there's another cell we probably need to know about before we even call the natural killer, the NK cell. And it goes around making sure every cell in the body is presenting up what's going on inside. And if it doesn't see it, it's going to kill it.
Yep.
It's going to kill it. And
no MHC, you're dead.
And at some point, I'd love to tell an aside in that area. So maybe at the end I'll throw that. We'll get back to the NK cell, but
in hour
we get
3,
past
yeah.
in hour 3. We get past the NK cell. So now the T cell, remember, it came out of the thymus, and all the T cells that would have responded to the self ones on the surface, they're all gone. Mm-hmm. So the T cells that are wandering around we'll call them the picky eaters. They have to see something they've never seen before.
Right.
And if they see that, they're going to engage, and there's going to be a transformation from a naive to now a memory T cell. And when that happens, the surface markers are going to change from a surface flag, a surface protein called CD5. It's alphabetical. This is easy. CD5RA to CD45RO. And that's going to mark them as now a memory.
And those memory cells stick around for long periods, and when you re-encounter this antigen, they can immediately proliferate. That's why we call them memory cells.
So they're important, very important for immunization programs, aren't they?
That's how vaccines work. Sure.
Well, indeed, that's what we're talking about, isn't it?
Yeah,
Gee, you know what, Dickson?
Well, I just wanted to bring the listeners up to date as to why we're going into all this detail, because really this group is very concerned about the administration of vaccines.
Sure.
And they've got one in particular in mind here, too, by the way, which is... I was really curious as to why they focused on that, but
we'll finish this off, and we'll get back to the heart of the paper. So now we have naive T cells, which are CD45RA on the surface. Yep. We have memory T cells, which are, as we know, T cells, CD4 positive, but now CD45RO positive. And then there's two types of memory. There's effector and central memory.
You got to love the terms.
They're great. There's partial memory and no memory at all.
What's the
that's my
difference
kind of
between
memory
them?
cell.
Now the central memory is Dickson can epitomize it. He's the guy. He's sitting around. He remembers what happened a really long time ago.
Yeah.
It takes him a little while to kind of remember. The effector memories are the ones that are sort of raring to go. They know what happened, and they're waiting to jump.
I used to be one of those, but not
Dixon
any
used to
longer.
be an effector memory cell.
That's
No, so they're
ineffective.
They're a
can
little
be-
closer to fully active.
They can be distinguished by surface markers. right?
Again, your central memory are going to have CD27 on the surface, which was also the memory cell marker in human B cells. And then the effector memory will be CD27 negative. So we're using flow cytometry to be able to take blood, look in there, and see how many effector memory, how many central memory, how many naive, etc. And the reason that why are they doing all this?
Why are they doing this?
Why are they doing all this?
Because they can.
They're doing more than that. They're doing it because tuberculosis is a huge problem in the world, and they're trying to understand why are we having problems creating an immunological response that protects people from getting tuberculosis, and that we can bring in our effector memory, our central memory, Dickson here, to talk a little bit about this vaccine BCG.
Isn't it a good thing, by the way, during the eradication of smallpox campaign that they didn't think about all this? They just went ahead and vaccinated everybody.
It's called empirical, right?
No, I know that, because if they had all this to deal with, they probably
Well, it
would
worked,
have done all
you
this
know.
investigation. Of course
So
it did.
the low-hanging
Of course it
fruit
did.
of
That
vaccines,
was very low-hanging fruit.
polio, influenza, measles, smallpox.
That's right.
They just made the vaccines and they work. And that's it. But now with tricky pathogens like
the ones that didn't go away. That's right.
HIV, respiratory syncytial
that's it.
virus. It's not low-hanging fruit.
No, it
so
isn't.
you need to do some work.
Yep.
And we need to fund this work, which means we need more money from the federal government.
Indeed.
Not just $30 billion a year. But
No. So one of these investigators used to be at the NIH.
So they take these patients who are either infected or uninfected, they get their blood, and then they look at all the different memory CD4 cell populations, right?
They do, and they start off by saying, just at baseline when you don't do anything, it's pretty similar.
In these two populations,
In these two populations. The lower infected patients from basically Western Africa, and the 14 folks hanging around Bethesda.
But then they put them in culture and start adding things.
And then it gets interesting. Then they start finding stuff.
But they add weird things, Daniel. They add. Well, first of all, they give them all abbreviations, which really bothers me because I have to remember them.
Yeah.
So one of these things that they add is called BMA.
Yes.
An extract from Brugia malayi.
That's right.
Excellent.
Another filarial
Excellent.
parasite.
Why?
Because they had it on hand, and it represents a very large group of people in the world that are either infected with Wuchereria, Bancrofti, or
Wuchereria,
right, or Brugia malayi. Those are the two most commonly occurring lymphatic filarial infections in the world.
They want to add this extract of the culture and see what these memory cells do.
Right.
Yeah, it's too bad. I agree with you. There's way too many abbreviations, and they get introduced too quickly.
It's called alphabet soup.
And there's actually a lot of room. I mean, if they had enough room to write unstimulated, they could have put filarial antigen, mycobacterial antigen.
So this is one reason why in our textbook we don't use abbreviations for the most part. We spell out every word because you see it and you immediately know, with few exceptions. The other one is a staph antigen, right?
True.
Staph enterotoxin B, which they call SEB. And then the other one is CFP10.
Which is really a mycobacterial
Is that
antigen.
mycobacterial?
Yeah.
Okay, got it.
And I don't even know if they defined, I think they assumed, everyone knows what CFP10 is.
They didn't define it, really.
I don't even know if they defined it in the text. So if you take this figure, which is figure 1, and it sort of followed their tables, it's really the important one. And what they're going to do is they're going to take unstimulated cells, and they're going to be looking, and now it's interesting, now they're doing what's called intracellular staining. Mm-hmm. This is flow cytometry brought one step forward. And there's a Gary Nolan also out at Stanford who did a lot of work in this area. And what you do is you take these cells and you permeabilize them. You make holes in the membrane so you can get antibodies inside of the cells to look for what's inside the cell. And they're going to look for interferon gamma. They're going to look for TNF, tumor necrosis factor alpha. They're going to look for interleukin 4 and interleukin 10. And they're going to look at baseline, but then they're going to stimulate, they're going to expose the cells to filarial antigens, mycobacterial antigens, and staph bacterial antigens to see what happens to these cells, to see how much interferon gamma, how much TNF alpha, IL-4, and IL-10. And what do they see?
They see some differences in some of the responses, but not all of the responses. So if you go down the list of tumor necrosis factor alpha, for instance, and look, you can see in some cases, I would call them differences. The unstimulated cells look like they're different to begin with. So the population has already had a response that has elicited TNF, whereas the uninfected group has not. When you look at the error bars for these cell distributions, I don't know, Dan, perhaps you're used to looking at these more than I am, but would you call that a difference?
The only areas where they see statistically significant differences, and I think it's probably important to focus on those.
You have to stress that point.
Is when they're looking at the differences in the IL-4 positive cells after exposure to these antigens. I mean, you see some little differences in other situations, but consistently all the way down for IL-4.
Yeah, that's a consistent difference. That's true.
More IL-4 in the infected lymphocytes after stimulation with these 3 different protein extracts.
And so these are cells that were obtained from patients, from people that had lower infection, compared to the 14
from NIH.
Uninfected Bethesda crowd.
Right.
So what is IL-4?
Well, IL-4 is, well, as we saw in the title, it's a particular signature cytokine of a type of differentiated memory T cell. And what does that mean? Well, there are several types of memory T cells. We talked about already two types, right? The effector memory and the central memory. But to go back to the terminology of helper T cells, the T cell is going to help direct a certain type of immune response. And the immune response might be, we'll start off with what we normally don't think of, but a tolerant immune response. You might say, I'm going to tolerate this tissue, and that would be, we think of maybe an IL-10 response. It might be an anti-tumor response, and from a T cell, we think of a IL-17, or maybe an interferon gamma, which would also carry over to a tuberculosis type response, perhaps. The IL-4 is more, I'm going to use this word, Th2 type response, what we classically think of as a type 2, an antibody, and
antibody biased response, right?
And that's actually, I think, the meat of this paper. What they're trying to say is these people who have chronic or have been infected with LOA, when they see the mycobacterial antigen, you're not seeing the interferon gamma response that you're really wanting to be protective and to really fight tuberculosis.
Is that what you would want for tuberculosis?
That's what classically you would want.
Interferon gamma, I see.
But they're claiming here that you are getting this pronounced IL-4 type response, which is different than what you want. And this ties in with their concept of why you might have problems when you try to vaccinate these people, because they're already primed to respond in this IL-4 direction.
So for protection against tuberculosis, antibody is not useful?
We don't think so, actually. We think you can completely remove the antibody response, and what you really need for TB is the ability to activate macrophages with interferon gamma T cell assist.
T cells also?
So that the T cells are involved with the activation of the macrophages. So what you want to do is drive your response towards a Th1, I'll say, an interferon gamma type T memory cell. It's going to work with your macrophages, move them from naive macrophages to the M1, to the activated macrophage phenotype, which can actually destroy and kill the mycobacteria.
And that we talked about a few podcasts ago.
Yes.
The M1 macrophage population. So the macrophages will then kill the tuberculosis bacteria.
True.
Right?
Unfortunately, our naive macrophages can't kill the mycobacterium. The mycobacterium get inside, and they actually thrive until you have activation, which can finally allow them to be killed.
In this first panel, they've looked just at CD4 cells, but in subsequent panels, they look at central memory and effector memories. Is there any difference in these with respect to this kind of phenotype, this IL-4 biased phenotype, or is it hold for all of them?
I think it holds across. If you compare in the next figure, they look at naive, they look at central memory, they looked at effector memory. They look at this other TEMRA, which is an RA effector T cell. You don't see anything here that is as dramatic, I would say, as what we saw in the first panel.
Yeah. Looks like the effectors are in particular skewed to IL-4. Now they've focused just on IL-4 because this is the one that they find is the difference. Looks like the effectors, which are the guys out there working, right? Which Dickson used to be an effector.
Used to be.
Those are the ones that are central a little bit. I don't know what these other two populations are.
Right.
Naive, I understand, but I don't know what TEMRA is.
So TEMRA, remember we talked about with memory that they become RO positive from RA? There actually is this RA positive type of, or I'll say RO negative type of effector cell. And that's what TEMRA. TEMRA stands for RA positive effector T cells. So they're not really a memory cell, but they're an effector T cell.
So we are left with this fact that people that have LOA infections aren't responding properly to a variety of antigens. They're making antibody biased response
Yeah.
when they should be making a cellular biased response, right?
Yep.
What can we do about this?
Well, I had another question
are we
before we
them,
move on.
Yes.
I had a question about the age spread of the 25 people that they looked at and how long had they had their infections to begin with. Because there's probably no way to know that just by taking random serum from people that are infected with these things. So to look at the natural history of the development of this kind of response, you'd have to start with small children and do studies on them over time, maybe take 1,000. And I don't know, is that kind of a study possible still?
The study that came to
'Cause
mind
that's
when I read
expensive,
this
I
was, so the
imagine.
mean age of the infected people was 34, but there was quite a range in there from 24 up to 62.
But no real young people.
No one below the age of 24. But what I wondered about, if you eradicated the worms, if you dewormed these people, which
Another
is
great
these
question.
huge programs,
That's right.
and then repeated these
That would
studies.
be interesting.
Right.
Maybe there's a
Yeah.
long-lasting
Yeah.
effect there.
Yeah.
No,
That would be really
I know Tom
interesting to know.
Nutman from this study. I've had many conversations with him in the past when I was an effector cell and gone to the ASTMNH meetings, and Tom and I would sit and talk. And he was one of the proponents of a blanket community-based treatment program using diethylcarbamazine in the old days, but I think a substitute now for ivermectin, and mebendazole and one other, praziquantel probably. Those three drugs together to knock down the worm population so you could go back quickly, just addressing this issue of how soon afterwards have they returned to a normal pattern so that you could give an effective vaccine against a really life-threatening disease like tuberculosis. And,
you know what I find really interesting? So this explains why certain viral vaccines have been very effective.
Bingo.
Where antibodies are the preferred response, like polio, smallpox, measles, where you use it. The correlate of protection for these infections is antibody.
That's right.
Being infected with a worm doesn't matter because it's stimulating.
Well, it may even help.
Maybe it helped.
You may want to go to these areas to do your trials.
Exactly. Could be.
Yes. No, it's a very interesting idea that, and as you said earlier, when a vaccine works, we don't worry about why, we just use it. But now we're and we can look back and say, this is why the smallpox vaccine worked in many of these areas where people had these worm infections.
So there's another confounding conundrum to throw on top of all of this, and that is that these are also areas of high endemicity for malaria. And we've had a lot of discussion about malaria in the past, both from a control programs perspective and not a vaccine, but a vector control program. So what is the immune effector mechanisms that fight off malaria? Because you can get it again and again and again.
I don't know. Do we know if it's cellular?
We don't. We are
not?
struggling with that still. We haven't pinned down the mechanism. But when we do, will this suddenly say, well, we were shooting in the dark here. We should have been moving more towards cellular response immune vaccines rather than antibody.
Well, it's the same problem
vaccines.
with HIV. We're not sure what the correlate of protection.
But we're trying to do the vaccines without knowing anything about the mechanisms of protection, and that's a problem.
As I say, you try the lowest hanging
That
fruit
is a
first.
problem.
But the problem with AIDS vaccines is we've tried a lot and spent a lot of money, but we still haven't hit it. So we need to go back to the lab. Wouldn't it be interesting, though, to do this experiment in people who have malaria infections,
You bet.
toxoplasma?
Oh, they've all got a malaria. These people all have it. From West Africa, they've all got it. Every one of them.
Yeah, that was that was one of the confounders.
Every one of them has it.
Is they're not necessarily isolating a population that only has lower infection.
Couldn't do
what
it.
other helminthic parasitic infections do these people have or have had over time?
That was my other big question. Was they've got ascaris, they've got trichuris, they've got hookworm, they've got toxo, maybe.
Probably a lot of them,
Maybe.
right?
But that's not a tropical disease. I was just thinking about the parasitic diseases.
Yeah, I know, but you say most of the world is infected with toxo.
Absolutely right. And they eat a lot of meat, and they eat a lot of bush meat and that sort of thing. So that you'd get it from that source. So these people they've been bombarded with infections all their lives. No wonder their T cells are so skewed to begin with, right? So that's the biggest lesson I got out of this, even though I was not aware of all the details of these refinements that
But we did learn a lot today.
Dr. Griffin has brought to forefront.
Didn't we learn a lot?
Absolutely.
No, it is.
So-
it is a great article,
When
and
you're-
it brings us back to the question of what is the vaccination strategy that was previously employed for tuberculosis.
Exactly. BCG,
Well,
right?
was-
It's
yeah.
just BCG.
That was and is
So
actually
BCG was an attenuated infectious
the
bacteria.
Bacillus
right?
of Calumet and Guerin.
It's infectious, right?
I believe so.
There have been cases of, you think of it as, this is something that you can give people. It's similar to mycobacterium, but you don't get sick. Well, most people don't get sick, but some people do.
Some people do. That's right.
And particularly, a certain portion of the population that has chronic granulomatous disease, they can get really ill from the BCG vaccination.
Right.
And there's even been issues where we use BCG. This is interesting. People have bladder cancer. We fill their bladder with this BCG, this type of mycobacterial, and it induces an immune response that can sometimes help us control the cancer. But sometimes these are people who don't have the best immune status to begin with, and they can actually end up with an infection from BCG. It's a strategy that's been used. It may be one of the most given vaccines in the world.
I would say that's right.
And it's had really different results. One thing that's been consistent is its ability to protect children from meningeal TB, so extrapulmonary TB, so protecting children under the age of 5. But whether it does anything beyond that has really been different in different studies, and there might be an issue, as this person's bringing up. What's the background? What other infections might they have?
Sure.
What sort of immune priming is going on?
Yeah.
So, Daniel, here's a little case study, a mini case study for you. We have a lady from Honduras who picks our kids up after school and makes them dinner, right? So recently she's been out of breath, and so she went to her physician, and they did an x-ray, and she has this haziness on one of her upper lobes, right?
Okay.
They did a TB time test, or whatever they call it these
The
days.
PPD would be the...
PPDs. The first one was positive, so she went
Okay.
back a few weeks later, and he repeated it, and it was negative the second time. Okay, so
I'm enjoying this already.
then she went back last week for some procedure where they went into the lung and actually took some material out to
Bronchial
see
aspiration.
what it was, right? And yesterday she got the result. So she's out of breath.
Okay.
What do you need to know before you make your diagnosis?
This is bringing up this issue. Well, first off, is it or is it not TB
Right.
related?
So it's
and
not
then the
just-
second is it a latent or active?
So he did
infection?
a blood test for TB also. I don't know what
Yeah.
that would be.
That would be the quantiferon gold that we talked about,
right, and that was negative. So he said you don't have TB.
okay.
But
If done correctly, and both
Yeah.
of these tests for TB, whether it's the skin test or the quantiferon, well, I say quantiferon gold, but interferon gamma release assays or Igras. Now, we'll start off with the skin test. It's very easy to do the skin test wrong. To do the skin test properly, we've now moved to the PPD, the Purified Protein Derivative Manito skin test. And what you do is you take a certain amount of this purified protein derivative, and you inject it just barely under the skin.
Intradermal, right?
It's intradermal,
Intradermal.
and that's key.
It's hard to do that,
It's
right?
Extremely
it is
difficult.
hard to
You
do.
know, someone did it to me once, and she was explaining. She said, "Look, to know where I'm in the right place, I put the needle, then I lift the skin up a bit to show that I'm
do
in
you
the
know
right
what you have to
place."
inject it with? A tuberculin syringe.
Yeah, right. Really tiny.
Yes, the tuberculin.
That's why
Is that
it's
correct,
named
Daniel?
that.
You have to lift. You show it by lifting.
You
the-
should do that, because if let's say I'm trying to get it through my health screening and I want it to be negative, all I have to do is just go a little bit deep, and if I inject it
Now
a
you're
little bit
sub-Q.
deep, it will actually, if you do it sub-Q, it will actually just be brought away. All the antigen will be brought away by the
So
lymphatics.
why is
and it will be
intradermal
negative.
important? Is that because the Langerhans cells are there and they're reacting? to it?
Exactly.
Bingo.
So you want it right there, and you want to read it properly, 48 to 72 hours, and you're reading induration, hardness. You can't look at it from across the room. And people go, "Oh, that looks fine." No, you need to actually. And there have been meetings where you're supposed to do it with a ballpoint pen, and you bring the ballpoint pen until you hit hardness, and then you make a line. You come from the other side, hit hardness, and you're not doing it.
Then you
from-
measure it, right?
Yeah, and you're doing it side to side. You're not doing it along the length of the arm. And then there are certain cutoffs depending. Like this person from Honduras, if it was larger than 10 millimeters of induration in diameter, then you would say it's positive. And you don't repeated, actually, in this population. Particularly if it's positive, you don't repeat it. Because they do it the next time it's negative. You're going to say, well, the first time you knew what you were doing.
Yeah.
The second time you went too deep.
So what else is in your differential diagnosis, doctor?
And the other, now we're going to go to the Igra test. The Igra test is actually a tricky test to do properly.
Huh.
Again, this is going to be, you're going to draw blood, you're going to isolate the buffy coat, the white cells, and you're going to be exposing them to either nothing, there's a nil tube, or you're going to be exposing them to a positive control to make sure you have T cells that can activate. And then the third, you're going to expose them to, there's 2 available out there. One uses 2, and the quantiferin gold uses 3 proteins, stimulants that are unique to mycobacterium tuberculosis relative to BCG, as crossover with a couple, Kansasii and Cheloni, I think. But it's not going to cross-react with BCG. And that, if you do it properly, is a great test. But, you're working on living cells. You've got to make sure they get to the lab in time. You've got to draw it up properly. You got to shake it around so that they get exposed to the antigen.
Yeah.
A lot of times I worry about the ability to get accurate results from those tests.
So why didn't they take a sputum and do an acid-fast test and then culture?
Okay, so the other thing
why.
is, if
It's a good
this
question.
woman had, so if the woman has active disease, the way you're going to, the woman has latent disease, so it's sitting there doing nothing, you're going to need to use one of these immunological tests. But if you're worried that the person actually, she's short of breath, she's having symptoms, then you're starting to think of active disease. Now, active disease, often a positive PPD can become negative. So the sensitivity of your PPD and your Igra, your blood test for TB, go down during active disease. So I always say those are tests of latent disease. If you want to test for active disease, that's when you want to get sputums. That's when you want bronchoalveolar lavages. That's when you want PCRs and cultures.
Well, he had concluded that she didn't have TB. That's why he put her in for this.
So what else could it be?
Well, that's what I asked Daniel. What else is
A
left?
lot of, people in the world get bacterial pneumonias. There could be prior infections. Histo is not uncommon in that part of the world. I think people forget. And that's often I say, if you think of TB, do a urine for a histoantigen.
Now, there's a little history that I didn't tell you. She used to smoke.
Okay.
Oh, no.
She stopped, 20 years ago, but she smoked for many years.
Still.
Yeah.
So it turns out it's COPD.
Okay. Okay.
So advanced
But
COPD.
yeah, and cancer, people get cancer. Just because you're born in Honduras doesn't mean
she was worried that she had lung cancer.
Yeah.
Sure.
And we were worried too, because then she wouldn't work for us.
So she's now being treated by that drug I see on the ads all the
I don't
time
know
during
what
the
you
news
do,
programs.
What you do for COPD, if anything.
There are some drugs.
Well, it's interesting. What actually really helps with COPD? There's a lot of things that help symptomatically, but one of the only things that actually has an impact on mortality is making sure people stop smoking and that they get oxygen if they need it. Most of the broncho inhalers, bronchodilators, the puffers, the MDIs, they help with symptom control, but very limited data with regard to them actually helping with long-term.
One last comment, though. She said she never used to have any health care. She signed up for Obamacare.
Yeah,
she said, without this, I would not be able to even know what's wrong with me.
How about that?
That's great.
Put another check mark on that box, too.
Yeah. This is what it's for.
That's right. That's exactly right.
No, what's the only problem with Obamacare? It's not as good as it needs to be. It's a step.
It's a start, right?
In a direction.
You know what? If you don't do anything, it's worse.
Let's have you do another case.
Okay. Hopefully people are ready for another case.
I promise I won't look over your shoulder.
This one, Dickson can't look over my shoulder.
And no Googleable terms. Although this time it was a red herring to Google, right? Because they got.
Well, last time if you Googled what was it, crawfish, Missouri, you got it.
You got it, but
this
not Beaver.
This is not a Googleable case. Googleable, is that a verb?
Yeah, Googleable.
Googleable. You can't Google and get this one. And also, I have to say, when I got the diagnosis on this one, I was like, huh. And so
interesting.
So this is the one that I'm going to be very curious when I actually give Dickson the answer, how he responds.
It's going to be a while because you're going to be away.
It's going to be a while, so he's going to have to think about this for a while. Now, as I always say, this is a real case. So this person did not read the textbook, but he did give us a great history.
This is from Colorado also?
No, this is Long Island.
Okay.
This is a local kid. It's May. And a 21-year-old male college senior. He's the son of an internal medicine physician out on Long Island. He returns from a trip to Kenya and reports that he's feeling poorly. This young man initially went to his primary care physician, not his dad, and reported that he felt fine upon returning, but 1 week after getting back, he started to develop discomfort in his upper abdomen. He has no diarrhea, but his appetite is somewhat decreased. He reports no fever, no chills, no cough, no headache. He has no past medical, no past surgical history, not allergic to anything, says nothing runs in the family, doesn't take any medications.
How long was he in Kenya?
Aha. That was a joke, folks. That was a joke.
He was in Kenya for 2 weeks.
Where was he in Kenya?
We're in Kenya. There's a big city, right,
I'd like
in
to
Kenya?
know where. Yeah, it's Nairobi.
And he says that he stayed there in Nairobi. He stayed in very nice hotels.
Sure.
And what they do, they pick him up in the morning, and they would be in these minivans. And for the 2 weeks, they go out every day to these
game
areas
parks.
and see the game parks.
They're
and see the
fantastic.
animals.
So he was a tourist.
He was a tourist.
5 miles outside of Kenya, you can see, or Nairobi, you can see a lion take down a zebra.
And what kind of water did he drink?
He said he only, he
Bottled?
He drank bottled waters. He drank a lot of soda, actually.
Food?
There was. He actually said the food was quite nice in these hotels.
Yep.
So he ate the nice food in the hotels. They actually, I believe, they give them these packed lunches. They got like a box lunch that they take with them because they're out all day.
Right.
He was ill at the day he arrived back in the U.S.?
No, he felt fine for about a week.
Okay.
He'd been back for a week, feeling fine, and then he started to develop this upper abdominal pain.
He never went more than a day's worth of car ride away from Nairobi.
No. Every day they'd get picked up in the minivans,
Okay.
do their thing, and then come back.
Never got down to Amboseli.
No.
Okay. Did anybody else on the trip get sick?
Not that he knows of.
He was all by himself, though. I mean, he arrived and then got thrown into an ad hoc group that went on tour.
No,
every day?
this was one of those setup tours. Where he went. I mentioned his dad's a physician. He went with his dad.
So other people of his family went with him.
Yeah.
And they didn't get sick. He just got sick.
Just him.
Is he jaundiced?
He is not jaundiced.
And you're not going to tell us about the laboratory test because that'll give it away,
I'll
right?
give it away, yes. All
Or
right.
not.
That's all we're going to have?
What else shall I tell you? Do you guys have any other? You should ask some more questions.
We should ask some more questions. Did he have any unusual events while he was on his safaris? Like, did he trip, or did he get attacked by something, or did he get bitten by something, or did
Mosquitoes?
or tsetsis, or whatever?
Tsetse? In Kenya they have tsetsis.
Oh, yeah, big time.
Did he notice any insects?
He noticed some bug bites, but he didn't say he noticed too many. He said, "Yeah,
He
I
did
got
have
bit
bug
by a
bites.
few things."
But the
Those are not
hotel
ordinary
was
bugs over there.
the hotel was fancy, so it had windows with
Air
air conditioning, closed
Sure.
windows, right?
Sure. And what time of the year was it? May. You said May.
It was in May.
May. Okay.
Did he have relations with anyone while he was there?
Sexual
Yes,
relations.
sexual relations.
Or others.
Or other relations.
Right.
He did not report having any sexual relations with any other travelers or any native peoples.
Or any animals?
Or any animals, no.
Okay.
No.
And he ate bottled water. He didn't eat anything unusual. No raw meats. Anything. of
No,
that
he said
sort?
everything.
Cooked.
I did ask that. Those are good questions. And I said, no, everything looked like it was well cooked. And
And
a
vegetables.
lot of times there were buffets.
Vegetables were cooked. He didn't eat a salad that was not
He
cooked.
didn't eat a lot of salad, he said.
He did eat some.
He ate some, but he's not a big vegetable eater.
But he ate salads,
But he
which
did
would
eat
have been
some.
raw Dickson and washed with local water, probably not bottled water, right?
Perhaps.
You're not too worried about that?
No, not in the bigger hotels in Nairobi. I think they're okay.
Do you ever go to a local vegetable market or meat outside market and do something there?
No, he did not.
You did not.
No real Maasai market things.
No.
Did he bring home any tchotchkes?
Tell me what those are.
Wood objects,
Just trinkets,
cloth objects,
objects,
things
souvenirs.
that you buy from souvenir stores. That's right.
Not that he reports.
Did he report?
Not that he reports.
Does he
Right.
smoke?
He does not smoke. He says he only drinks social alcohol. He lives with some friends in a rented house. As I mentioned, he's a university student and he volunteers at a preschool.
Does he eat crayfish?
He did. I specifically asked him about the kelp. He did not. He didn't eat any raw crayfish.
So this could be something he picked up in Long Island as well, right?
Well, it's always possible.
Possible.
Yeah, maybe Kenya's a red herring in this case.
Well, could be. Do you have any physical examination results?
So he is afebrile at the time of the visit. His blood pressure is normal. His heart rate is about 70. He's breathing comfortably. And there's nothing too remarkable on the exam.
He has an upper abdominal pain, which means below the rib cage?
So it's below the rib cage, sort of central.
Is this continuous or intermittent?
Attack, you mean?
No, it's not over on the right side. He doesn't have what we call Murphy's sign, right? When you push on the gallbladder's fine.
It's continuous or intermittent pain?
Relatively continuous.
Is it a sharp or a dull pain?
I'd say along more of a sharper pain. And by sharp, what does sharp mean? Sharp means different.
Well, as feeling like a knife is being inserted as opposed to pressure.
Yeah,
right.
It's more of a sharp.
Okay.
Identifiable as a spot that he can put his finger on.
And did you palpate the abdomen?
So in this case, I actually was in the parasitology lab when we have the diagnosis. So I didn't palpate his actual belly. Him.
Okay. Did no one palpate him?
But he was palpated.
And did
it was
he scream when you...
just a little uncomfortable. He's actually not doing that bad.
Okay. Normal stool?
He doesn't report any diarrhea or any problems with his stools.
And we're not going to go through what it can't be, are we?
No. I just want to collect some more information for our listeners and us. Normal urine as well?
He had a urine test, and that was normal. Actually, as mentioned, we did labs. So CBC,
did you endoscope
chemistries,
him? Did you
endoscope him?
Yeah.
What kind of endoscope?
Well, the kind that you can see through. You can go down through the stomach into the duodenum and see what might be there.
Okay, so you're interested in endoscoping this 21-year-old man.
Well, with an unexplained central abdominal pain, maybe.
Okay.
Yeah, maybe I would like to endoscope him.
I don't think that he did that.
Do you want anything? Should we just open him up, Vincent?
No.
No, you don't have to do that.
An endoscope is a big deal. You don't want to just do this without cause. I don't even know if an X-ray is called for at this point, right?
No, I recall. I'll just say that this is an anecdotal type of thing.
Yeah,
now.
tell me.
It doesn't relate to this case at all, but there was a case history that I remember very distinctly being told to me by a gastroenterologist here. A cab driver from Yemen pulled over to the side of the road in extreme pain, upper abdominal pain, was taken to the emergency room. They asked him where he was from. He said he was from Yemen. They shipped him off to the GI examining room, and they endoscoped him. And on endoscope, they saw an adult hookworm attached to his small intestine.
Wow. I think that's pretty radical.
It was pretty esoteric stuff.
To scope him for that.
Pretty esoteric stuff.
You could have given him a drug and then watched the worm come out, right?
But there's another set of infections which is instant onset and related to the habit of eating raw fish, which we've talked about before too. So he ate no raw fish at all.
He does not report any raw fish ingestion. So why don't you guys tell me what tests you would be interested in? I won't give you any of the answers to
blood.
these.
Go to CBC. Let's say the CBC.
Okay, so you're going to want a CBC, which we'll talk about next time. What else would you? I'm not going to give you any answers.
I'd like liver enzymes.
You want liver enzymes? Okay.
All right.
What else should we do?
Do you want malaria smears, ONPs, any serologies?
Too early for that.
Okay.
Pre-patent period, too early. But, I mean, if you heard he's been to Kenya, I think, yes, you should probably do one anyway, but it's probably not going to give you much.
There's a lot of diseases in Kenya.
There's a ton of them. There is. But, yeah, there is. But surprisingly few people catch them when they go over there, though, because they're coddled. They're treated like they're living in the United States, basically, on tour. So they know all of these things, and they can avoid most of it, but not all of it.
Is there malaria there, Dickson?
Oh, yeah,
but this is too early for that, you're saying.
Well, his onset of symptoms would be, in my view, at least too early, but that's not an onset of symptom for malaria as far as I can see. But it is for some other things, so I would... If you do a stool examination and you're expecting to find eggs produced by worms, for instance, they're not going to be there because this is much too early for that.
I have one more question. Did he have any immunizations before he went?
Yes, he did.
Huh.
What did he have?
He had his hepatitis A, his hepatitis B.
Good idea.
He did oral typhoid, and he took malaria prophylaxis.
What about a tetanus?
His tetanus was up to date.
Well, there's one vaccine that he didn't get that he should have, but I'm not going to mention it.
Yeah, we won't mention that. And I'm leaving it out purposely, too. Not that it may or may not even be relevant, but just we'll keep it interesting.
Okay.
There's a couple potential other vaccines that I didn't mention that would be indicated.
Well, it's enough of a mystery.
I think so. Let
keep
people
everybody
chew
guessing.
on that. Let people chew on it. We'll get a range of answers, but you can Google Kenya.
Yeah, and I think so. And this is one where it's not quite as easy, shall I say. I think the other ones so far today, if you really worked through it, you say, this is what it has to be.
I think the word straightforward is a better way to put it, because this might be straightforward once you explained everything.
I guess that's true.
Let me just read a couple of emails because we've gone a long time here, but I do want to read just a few. Robin had written about teeth. I guess we talked about teeth last time.
Yes, that was my where my wife had said that the adult teeth, the baby teeth move out of the way to make room for the baby teeth, and I was horrified that she had anthropomorphized the teeth and that my children would grow up with a warped, non-scientific worldview.
So he writes, heterodont dentition has to accommodate to a changing jaw size, hence 2 sets of teeth in diphyodonts. That's
that's us.
Homodont polyphydiodonts have no such problems, such as sharks and crocs. Heterodont polyphyodonts tend to have lifespans sufficiently long to wear out the first set of permanent teeth and go through life with more sets of teeth, as in the case of the elephant. The natural life expectancy of hunter-gatherer humans is somewhere into the mid-20s and early 30s, enough for 1 set of permanent teeth. Agriculture has been around for 10,000 years. You want to go to the seminar?
No, I'm good.
Okay.
I have a 2:00 call with a physician in Malawi, so I just
nice.
I have plenty of time.
I just wanted to read a few. We'll be done.
No, we have plenty. You read away.
Agriculture has been around for around 10,000 years, too brief in the relevant evolutionary timescales to have significant selection pressure towards polyphyodonty. And with modern dentistry and prosthodontics, selection pressures for polyphyodonty have been effectively evaded. That's true. We've evaded a lot of things by medicines. But
now, if my wife had only explained this to the children,
you could have
anthropomorphizing the teeth. Now you listen. Right. Listen, young children.
You can have
You're all polyphyodonts.
You can have them listen to this. All right, we have one. I'm scrolling through all those guesses. This was just amazing. Tim writes, Dear TWiP Trio, first of all, I'd like to say that adding a third member to TWiP was a great idea. Dickson's idea. I will admit it. It's your idea. It's a great idea. I love the case studies, although I can't say I have enough expertise to make much more a wild guess based off my listening to early episodes of TWiP and Google searches. I found this paper this morning and can't remember this parasite ever being discussed on the show, so I thought I'd forward it on. Have a great week. I'm off to the farm to haul manure on the fields while they're still solid in the early morning cold before they turn back into their spring muddy state by mid-morning. This is our friend from Minnesota, our dairy farmer friend. It's a paper called Human Infections with Sarcocystis Species.
Yeah, we haven't discussed
Should we talk about it sometime?
We could.
Do you like Sarcocystis, Daniel?
Sure, that would be great one to discuss.
Anne, our friend in Missouri, in Beaverton, Oregon, this is her guess of the crayfish case. A wonderful case this week of the patient from Missouri. I love the shift to sharing less information, although Dickson can't bear not to ask the question that nails the diagnosis. Go, Dickson. Wouldn't have gotten it without the crayfish question. I have seen this in a cat many years ago. Not sure of the cat's travel history. So Anne, just to remind you, is a vet in Beaverton, Oregon, and a PhD. A PhD vet. Those are rare.
They are.
Are you an MD PhD?
Yes.
A recent PhD.
But not a DVM? That's where you're a vet.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Kenneth, this is Paragonymous, right. So that was another guess. Best guess of a longtime listener, full-time layman, and someone who watched the first season of Monsters Inside Me,
Good.
which I heard through this podcast.
Nice.
Don't actually own a TV, so I downloaded the show.
Ah.
Thought it a tad sensationalist.
Yeah, I would agree with that, actually. I would. Yeah.
Are you still an advisor?
I am. I only advise about the scientific accuracy and not about the way it's actually presented.
Hopefully I didn't miss something obvious, but I tend to listen to the podcast at work. All the Twixes have been great company through many an overnight shift of dementia/hospice caregiving. All my co-workers think me a weirdo. Love the new format and increased frequency. Danke, Kenneth. Jennifer writes, I'm a grad student and one of your undocumented listeners. I use the Stitcher app, and I really like the show. My guess is Paragonymous. A few weeks ago, I think number 83, a listener mentioned Bob Lane's work that shows the western fence lizards have a bactericidal agent in their blood that cleanses Lyme-infected ticks. Yeah, this is cool, but I was surprised that the malaria parasite Plasmodium mexicanum, which commonly infects these lizards, was not mentioned, especially with all the musings about malaria-infected dinosaurs. Actually, in the vein of looking at parasitic infections of wild animals, the malaria infection of the western fence lizard may be one of the longest-running studies out of there. Dr. Joseph Schall, who was my parasitology professor while I was an undergrad at U Vermont, has 30-plus years of blood smears from infected lizards from a Hopeland, California field station, and has done many studies on the impact, ecology, and clonal diversity of infection in these lizards. Perhaps you'd like to read one of his current articles or have him call into the show. I wonder if lizard telomeres are shortened by malaria infection, too. That's cute. Also, right now in grad school, I work with the organism in which telomerase was discovered, Tetrahymena thermophilia, and enjoyed the shout-outs to the Nobel winners for this. Tetrahymena is really way more interesting than many give it credit for, so I thought this episode was just all around fantastic. Jennifer. That would be interesting to hear him talk about malaria in lizards, wouldn't it?
Yep.
Alan writes, my guess would be Paragonymyces. Give him some of that wonder stuff that my parasitology professor back at Tulane, Barney Klein, helped bring over from the vets for human treatment.
Barney, I know Barney very well.
Praziquantel.
Yeah, he's good.
Yeah, you know Barney?
Friend. He was a good friend, yeah.
We have our own cousins of this on the big island of Hawaii, sort of our own local Longsland, Nantucket babesiosis. I won't give it away, so if you want some time, I'll send you a case workup as a weekly mystery.
Right.
Would you like that, Daniel?
That would be good. I like that.
Keep up the good work.
By the way,
best podcast on the web.
Look at that. It's my impression, by the way, that Barney Klein has passed away, but that could be confirmed by looking it up. I believe he did.
Alan, you can send us your... you got a hawk out there?
Right at the window. I mean, this hawk is willing to
These
come
two
in and
gentlemen
be part of the podcast.
Are facing the window.
We get to watch the hawks.
We get to watch the hawks, the eagles.
I can see their eyes, averting.
Yeah, the helicopters.
Anyway, Alan, do send us your case. We'd love to. I mean, you can stump all of us, right? We'll wait a week.
Exactly. We're stumpable. Trust me.
Then we have Bjorn, who wrote about the Guyana patient. Remember that?
Yes.
Sure.
And offered his guess of leishmaniasis.
Right.
Which it wasn't, right?
No.
It was not. I started listening to TWiP, the Twix podcast, about a year and a half ago when I was following Vincent's virology course on iTunes. I later took the Part 2 course, How Viruses Cause Disease, on Coursera. Now I'm taking a Coursera course on tropical parasitology, protozoans, worms, vectors, and human disease.
Excellent.
And just finished the module on leishmaniasis. So
nice.
If what I wrote is correct, then I've learned something. And if not, I guess I haven't learned enough yet. Anyway, I love TWiP, and I certainly don't love parasites. I do find them fascinating.
Yeah.
One more. Actually, it's the last one. From AJ. Hello, DDV. I've been a long-time fan of Twix, and with TWiP being my favorite, I want to start by thanking you for all the time that you put into the series. It strikes an amazing balance between scientifically relevant yet fun and accessible. I've been interested in starting a career in parasitology and pathology for about 2 years, but have been rather baffled where to start. Let me explain my background without delving into self-pity. I'm a 26-year-old. I hope he doesn't eat crayfish. I'm a 26-year-old who graduated with a bachelor's degree in ecology, behavior, and evolution. Before going to college at UCSD, I wanted to be a marine biologist so I could swim with sharks all day and get rich, because scientists make tons of money, right? But once in school, I eventually drifted into focusing on entomology. I graduated with a GPA of 2.5, due primarily to a lack of attendance. I now find myself in a high-paying position with a local government doing inspections. Started in ag inspections due to my entomology experience, but now I do scale and meter inspections. While my job is decent in every way, I really feel I am in the wrong place for me. I like the idea of being a doctor because I am now hardworking, scientific-minded, and like the idea of making people's lives better in a direct way. Parasitology especially calls to me in all the ways that entomology did. Really, I just like learning life cycles that are so vastly different from ours. I'm also still interested in research. Here's the actual question.